Dopamine functions in the same way, regardless of whether we're addicted to drugs or social media. The modern world's excess of dopamine-triggering stimuli contributes to the current rise in mental health disorders. Overcoming challenges, completing difficult tasks, and abstaining can help us rebalance our reward pathways. Those are the main points made by Stanford University psychiatrist and best-selling author Anna Lembke, whom we interviewed for the first episode of a new Czech radio podcast, Bedny, which connects young Czechs with key global discussions.
Bedny, a series of interviews with international experts and questions from young Czechs.
Digital media lights up the same reward pathway as drugs and alcohol. Swipe right, swipe left. I was addicted to romance novels, which amazingly took me a while to realize, even though I'm an addiction doctor. When we're telling people, I actually spend 4 hours on TikTok last night, that awareness provides a motivation for change. I just thought, gosh, if more people had this information, they'd be able to leverage it in their own lives.
Anna Lembke is a globally renowned psychiatrist and author with a background in both the humanities and medicine. She leads Stanford University's clinic that deals with addiction and other disorders that people experience because of addiction. In 2021, Anna became widely known for her book Dopamine Nation, which quickly became a worldwide bestseller. Why is our modern-day addiction to pleasure causing us pain? What is the link between addictive substances and our day-to-day behavior like compulsive phone checking? What actually is the reward pathway, and what hope is there for those of us who have become slightly too addicted? And what advice would Anna give to young people from Central Europe hoping for careers in disciplines similar to her own? I'm happy and grateful to have Anna with me today to discuss what addiction is and how we can overcome it. Anna, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Anna, you published your book, Dopamine Nation, which many bookstores describe as an instant New York Times bestseller, in August 2021. Since then, influencers have been talking and even singing about dopamine and dopamine detox, often pointing out that addiction can arise from sources other than conventional drug use. Having been at the forefront of what is now almost a social media trend, what popular misconceptions about the neurotransmitter dopamine have you noticed that might not fully capture how it actually functions?
The major misconception I've noticed is people talking about getting addicted to dopamine itself. So dopamine is a chemical we make in our brain. It provides a very important signal to our brains about what to approach, explore, and get more of because it's important for our survival. But we don't actually get addicted to dopamine itself. It fluctuates in the brain, and those brain fluctuations are associated with the pathophysiology of addiction. So that's probably the major misconception that I encounter.
Talking of dopamine, I know that it's a neurotransmitter. What are these neurotransmitters? In your book, you describe them as baseballs between two neurons.
So neurotransmitters are chemicals that we make in our brain that allow for fine-tuned modulation of the electrical circuits that make up our mind. Our brain is essentially a bundle of wires. Those wires are neurons, but the neurons don't touch end to end. There's a gap between them called the synapse, and neurotransmitters are the molecules that bridge that gap between neurons. You might think of the presynaptic neuron as the pitcher in a baseball game, the postsynaptic neuron as the catcher, the ball itself as the neurotransmitter, in this case dopamine, and the pitcher throws the ball to the catcher who catches it with a mitt, which you can think of as the postsynaptic dopamine receptor.
You published your book about this neurotransmitter during the COVID-19 pandemic. Studies show that during the pandemic, screen time among children and young adults increased by more than 50% across the world. They also show that the levels of screen time never fully return to their original pre-pandemic levels. How big of a problem is it if I compulsively watch reels by guitarists or political commentators in the evening? Am I effectively experiencing the same phenomena in my brain as those that happen when people take drugs?
We know that digital media of all sorts lights up the same reward pathway as drugs and alcohol, which tells us that it releases dopamine in the reward pathway. And there is a growing body of evidence showing that the same kinds of changes that we see in the reward pathway when people get addicted to drugs and alcohol, we can see in the brain when people get addicted to smartphones, the internet, social media, online gambling, online shopping, etc. So based on that growing body of evidence, plus simple observation, what we're seeing in everyday life, but also what we're seeing in clinical care, tells us that people can indeed get addicted to digital media, and that as a result, they can experience the same kinds of health problems that people experience when they get addicted to substances. Those are mental health problems, physical health problems, sleep disturbances, mood problems, interpersonal problems, work-related problems, etc.
I've heard you talk about the drugification of social media. What does that mean? Are they designed to make us addicted?
Many forms of digital media include design features that have been engineered to intentionally keep us swiping and clicking, in essence, make us addicted to their platforms. And those design features are things that increase access, potency, quantity, novelty, and uncertainty. Those are the features that make anything addictive. The more access we have to our drug of choice, the more likely we are to use it, and the more likely we are to get addicted to it. And we now have 24/7 mobile access to the internet and digital media. Potency matters. That means the more dopamine that's released in the reward pathway and the faster that it's released, the more likely we are to get addicted to that substance or behavior. Digital media is highly potent, bright colors, musical sounds, narration, the ability to micro control what we're watching, when we're watching, the algorithms that have been designed for our specific preferences, showing us what we've liked before, but now with a bit of novelty. The other important feature of addiction is simple quantity, how much time we're spending consuming our drug of choice. With the infinite scrolls and bottomless bowls, and again, the For You algorithms that continue to feed us things that we've liked, we're very vulnerable to spend more time than we hoped and planned on those addictive platforms. The notifications are also important. Dopamine is very sensitive to novelty, and with the overabundance of notifications that pull us back to the platform, even when we're doing something else. The notifications in and of themselves release a little bit of dopamine, which then creates the desire to go and check and see if there's something even more rewarding waiting for us. So yes, indeed, many of these platforms have been designed to be addictive, and they are.
Even during in-person communication, dopamine is being released, and social media kind of tunes into that as well. If I get a like on something that I've shared, maybe I get this increase of dopamine that I would otherwise get if someone, maybe clapped their hands to something that I said or just agreed with me live. But this is kind of artificial, right? It's without the work of going somewhere and talking to someone in person.
Yes, exactly. So we are innately social creatures. We do better in groups. By being in a group, we can find mates, protect ourselves from enemies, and steward scarce resources. The way that our brains get us to connect with other people is in part by releasing dopamine when we make those human connections. So that's all well and good. The problem is that social media has taken the most reinforcing aspects of human connection and distilled them down into a drug. So now instead of having to get up off the couch, go outside, meet the people, make conversation, make effort, compromise, deal with conflict, resolve conflict, we can just sit back on our couch, swipe right, swipe left, and instantly have access to a universe of highly curated profiles that really don't resemble that person in real life, or may not even be a real person now that we have large language models, which are engineered to be obsequious and sycophantic and tell us exactly what we want to hear. And you're absolutely right. The like features are a part of this. So, for example, experimental designs have shown that when viewing, Instagram-like photos that have been liked by others, we are more likely to like them ourselves if they've been liked by others. And we also know that Instagram-style photos that have been liked by others release more dopamine in the reward pathway than Instagram-like photos that have been less liked. So this just speaks to the incredibly reinforcing nature of social validation and group belonging. When we experience social validation through a like or other mechanism, that is very reinforcing for our brains.
In your talks, you often mention homeostasis, a state of balance that is disrupted by pleasure and pain, two phenomena that our brain processes in similar locations. You frequently use the analogy of gremlins that hop on either side of a pleasure-pain balance. How does this analogy of a balance work?
So the balance represents, at a very simple level, how we process pleasure and pain, and how neuroadaptation is a fundamental mechanism by which our brains return to homeostasis. So imagine that in your brain, there's a balance like a teeter-totter in a kid's playground that is a simplified metaphor for how we process pleasure and pain. When we experience pleasure, it tips one way, pain, it tips the other. There are certain rules governing this balance, but the first and most important rule is that it wants to remain level with the ground. That's what neuroscientists call homeostasis. It's just basically our baseline condition, such that with any deviation from neutrality, our brains are going to work very hard to restore a level balance. How our brains do that is key to understanding what happens in addiction. So essentially, I eat a piece of chocolate that releases dopamine in my reward pathway because I like chocolate. My balance tilts to the side of pleasure. That feels good. But no sooner has that happened than my brain adapts to increase dopamine firing by downregulating dopamine transmission, involuting postsynaptic dopamine receptors, not just to baseline, but below baseline. This is called the opponent process mechanism, or simply neuroadaptation. You might imagine this as these little neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again. But the gremlins like it on the balance, so they don't get off as soon as it's level. They stay on until I've been tilted an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. That's the come down, the hangover, or just that moment of wanting to have one more piece of chocolate. Now, if I wait long enough and I don't have chocolate, the gremlins hop off, homeostasis is restored, and I go on my way. But if I continue to consume chocolate over days to weeks to months to years, those gremlins start to multiply. They get bigger and stronger, and eventually they're camped out on the pain side of the balance, tents and barbecues in tow. And now I've entered addicted brain. I've changed my joy set point. Now I need more of my drug in more potent forms, not to feel good, but just to stop feeling bad. And importantly, when I'm not using, I'm walking around with a balance tilted to the side of pain, experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance, which are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, and craving. And the reason this is so important is because addictive substances and behaviors lead to depression, anxiety, and insomnia. But many people come into our clinic seeking help for anxiety, depression, and insomnia and claim that they are self-medicating with their drug of choice because when they first use their drug, they temporarily feel better. What they don't realize is that in the long run, their drug is just augmenting the gremlins on the pain side of the balance, and they're digging themselves deeper and deeper into the hole. The better intervention for anxiety and depression that's caused by addiction is to abstain from our drug of choice for long enough to allow those gremlins to hop off so that homeostasis can be restored and we can again take pleasure in other more modest rewards.
I think what you're describing is the state of dopamine deficit. How long does it take for the balance to rebalance? Is it 2 weeks, 3 weeks?
On average, what we find in clinical care is it takes 4 weeks of abstinence for those gremlins to begin to hop off the pain side of the balance and for homeostasis to be restored. This doesn't mean that 4 weeks is a cure for addiction. It means that it's the amount of time it takes to get out of the state of acute withdrawal and to begin to see some kind of light at the end of the tunnel. We always warn people when they are going to begin a period of abstinence that they will initially feel worse before they feel better, because when they take their reward away, all those gremlins that have accumulated on the pain side of the balance will smash them to the side of pain. But if they can just wait those gremlins out, eventually the gremlins will get the message. There's no need for them to be there. They'll hop off and homeostasis will begin to be restored and people will begin to feel better.
Bedny on Radio Wave.
In Dopamine Nation, you mention an experiment where drinkers with depression were made to limit their alcohol consumption. And for 80% of them, their symptoms of depression decreased after a period of abstinence. How often do you think we can trace our mental health issues to a form of addiction?
In today's world, I think much of our mental and emotional distress can be traced to addiction because an increasing number of us is experiencing if not addiction, then at the very least compulsive overconsumption. We live in a drugified world where almost everything has been turned into a drug, made more accessible, more potent, more novel, more bountiful, such that I think we're all struggling with a dopamine deficit state where we have narrowed our focus on constantly rewarding ourselves and have lost the ability to take joy in other more modest rewards, as well as tolerate pain in any form. So I think that most of us living in the world today could benefit from a period of abstinence from highly reinforcing substances and behaviors in order to reset our reward pathways.
I loved reading your book, but maybe in the spirit of public service journalism, I might ask you about what you say to some of your critics who say that you oversimplify neuroscience using the metaphors you use, conflating the opioid system and the dopamine system, and that other neurotransmitters like GABA and serotonin are also in play when discussing mental health.
I explicitly say in my book that the pleasure-pain balance is an oversimplification and that there are many other neurotransmitters involved in this process, not just dopamine. But I think it's a helpful heuristic for people to think about the fundamental concepts of homeostasis and neuroadaptation. I'm really targeting the average lay person so that they can understand at a very basic level why tolerance develops, why they feel worse because of addictive behaviors. And importantly, I'm linking that to clinical scenarios, clinical stories, so that they can know what to do to make themselves feel better.
Anna, you're a practicing psychiatrist. You have mentioned in several of your interviews that at times it is difficult to help people with addiction. Could you share a story of someone who, with your help, overcame their addiction and was inspiring even for you personally? I think that in your book, you mentioned the story of a young woman who was so addicted to weed that she had to smoke it to get out of bed.
Yeah, so we see a lot of young people who are addicted to cannabis. Importantly, there are myths out there that cannabis isn't addictive. That's not true. About 16% of people in the United States who use cannabis will go on to get addicted to cannabis. And the insidious and difficult thing about cannabis is that many people identify it as medication for them because we do have medical marijuana dispensaries. And there is some evidence that not the plant itself, but some elements in the plant like THC have some short-term medicinal properties. The problem is the smoked plant probably doesn't have a medicinal benefit, especially when used in high potency and large quantities over long periods of time. So we have lots of patients coming in, like the patient you mentioned who I talk about in the book, who got to a point where she was smoking cannabis pretty much all day, every day, not going to school, not really getting out of bed or doing much of anything, and struggling with an enormous amount of anxiety. And she identified cannabis as the only thing that was helpful for her anxiety. But when I explained to her the way that the brain neuroadapts to chemicals like cannabis and the ways in which those gremlins accumulating on the pain side of the balance actually are contributing to and causing her anxiety, she was then willing to give it up for a month to see if she could feel better just by stopping smoking. And to her surprise, first of all, it was much more difficult to do than she thought it would be. She was very surprised at how much she struggled with acute withdrawal, including hyperemesis, so vomiting, which is, again, that opponent process mechanism. Many people use cannabis to help with nausea and vomiting, but ultimately it stops working, and then you can have a rebound effect and develop a vomiting syndrome. And she developed that once she tried to stop. She developed a profound vomiting syndrome, which was evidence to her that she had indeed become addicted. She hadn't believed that she'd become addicted. The other thing that really stood out for her was that by the time she got to week 4 of not smoking cannabis, her anxiety was so much better. Not just better than it had been in the first 2 weeks of acute withdrawal, but actually better than it had been in many years. And so that was a real aha moment for her, this realization that, wow, this thing that I was doing to relieve my anxiety was actually all along making my anxiety worse.
Even after the 4 weeks of rebalancing our dopamine system, it's unfortunately easy to relapse. You yourself have admitted to an addiction to romance novels. Have you been able to resist these literary temptations, or has it rather been an ongoing issue?
I would say it's an ongoing intermittent issue. So when I first recognized that I was addicted to romance novels, which, amazingly took me a while to realize, even though I'm an addiction doctor, and I gave it up, it was much more difficult to give up. I didn't read any romance novels for 1 month. And then I thought, well, I'm going to go back to using romance novels in moderation. I immediately binged on romance novels. I had, that's often called the abstinence violation effect. So at that point, I then decided to give it up for a year. And I was able to do that. And interestingly, after a year of not reading romance novels, I really didn't have much desire anymore. And when I would read them, I found that they were not reinforcing at all. And this is very common. People who have gotten addicted to a substance or behavior will report that substance or behavior gives them no pleasure at all anymore. And there's a real kind of grief with that because this is something that we have relied on for comfort or pleasure or whatever role it served. So that was interesting to discover that it doesn't really do it for me anymore. But still, I will occasionally have even euphoric recall and want to read a romance novel again. And then I will. And at first it'll be pleasurable, but very quickly I'll be like, I don't even, I don't want to be doing this. But still, it's amazing how that euphoric recall can drive reuse.
Mm-hmm. So what can we do to help? In your book, you mention Czech scientists who studied cold water immersion and saw an increase in dopamine levels by, I think, 500%. The overall effects and benefits of cold water submersion remain debated. But does the mentioned study prove that doing something uncomfortable increases our dopamine levels in a more long-term and maybe healthy way than our compulsive addictive behaviors? And how does this link to your abstain, maintain, and seek out pain mantra?
Right. So I'm getting back to the pleasure-pain balance. We know that when we press on the pleasure side, the gremlins go on the pain side. It turns out if we intentionally press at the pain side, those gremlins will go on the pleasure side and we can get our dopamine indirectly by paying for it up front. And that's probably how exercise makes us feel better. Exercise is acutely injurious to cells, but in response to injury, the body starts to upregulate feel-good neurotransmitters, including dopamine. That's probably what happens with cold water immersion. But even those neuroscientific studies aside, I think we can all relate to the human experience of doing something hard that's difficult in the moment that we wish would end sooner rather than later. And yet finding afterwards we feel really good. And it's a physiologic feeling. It's not just oh, I feel morally good because I did this right thing. It's no, I'm kind of high from enduring that physically or mentally challenging experience. So I do think that speaks to a way that we can get our dopamine indirectly by paying for it up front, which, by the way, is how our brains probably evolved. I mean, we evolved for a world of scarcity and ever-present danger where we would have to do a lot of upfront work to get a little bit of reward, which is importantly the opposite of the world that we live in now, where, we can sit on the couch, do almost nothing, and have this immediate rewarding stimuli delivered to our brains. So I do think we need to intentionally, moderate our pleasure. We need to intentionally make things less convenient and seek out pain. And we need to do that all in the service of kind of rebalancing our brains, which didn't evolve for this world of abundance.
The next question is from a young student of neuroscience, also named Anna. You mentioned dopamine addiction is a spectrum from a dopamine release perspective. How do you know whether what you're pursuing, be it a big or a small goal, is worthwhile versus when you're stuck in a reward pathway activation cycle, which basically is the start of addiction?
Yeah, great question. So I think the things to look out for are things that require very little effort and immediately change the way we feel. So that would be something like social media, right? Which is very reinforcing for our brains, feels good, kind of numbs us, relaxes us, lets us chill out. And we don't have to work very hard to get to that feeling. That's generally something you want to be wary of, as opposed to things that are effortful and difficult where the rewards are slower and delayed. We have to wait for them. So when you're thinking about pursuing goals, I would really recommend pursuing the kinds of goals that require your effortful, sustained engagement. And initially, the rewards aren't great, but with sustained effort over longer periods of time, you get there and then you get the payoff.
Bedny on Czech Radio.
There's some evidence that there's a higher likelihood of experiencing anxiety or depression if we live in more developed countries. Some social scientists attribute this to wealth inequality. You offer a slightly different hypothesis explanation, which reminds me of the Czech saying, pálí ho dobré bydlo. In other words, he's burned by his good life. Do you really think that the chief reason for more anxiety and depression in developed countries compared to the rest of the world is the number of stimuli and the overabundance that surrounds us? Are we essentially burned by the good life?
Yeah, so I really do believe we've reached some kind of hedonic tipping point where now we have so much pleasure and so much pain that our brains essentially can't compute. I think we've changed our brains physiologically such that the simple fact that we're constantly stimulating our brains with all of these rewards and not having to do much effort at all to get them is contributing to rising rates of depression, anxiety, and overall despair.
In Andrew Huberman's podcast, you said, keeping the image of the balance in mind gives people a way to imagine what they're experiencing on a neurobiological level, to understand it, and in that understanding, to gain some mastery over it, which is really what this is all about. Is this why you're so open to diverse interviews, talking among other people to a young Czech radio journalist? Do you think talking to young people about this could help them change course before their balance could break?
Yeah, I really do. That's kind of my mission, was to get these ideas out there. The basic neuroscience of addiction has been known for quite a while now. It's good science and it's been around for a long time. Not just the basic neuroscience, but also the clinical science, the observing the patterns and also what works to heal people. And I just thought, gosh, if more people had this information, they'd be able to leverage it in their own lives for their own self-improvement. So that was really my goal. And yes, I really try to talk to diverse people across different demographics and countries, just to kind of get the information out there.
I'm sometimes reminded of maybe some older philosophies in what you're saying. Do you think that people in the past kind of knew, maybe the Stoics or maybe some religious thinkers, they kind of intuitively understood and knew these things?
Oh, absolutely. Every major religion and philosophical teaching in the world has communicated this basic wisdom that the relentless pursuit of pleasure leads to misery, and that doing things that are hard is ultimately good for us. What I find exciting is that we now have neuroscience showing that that's true. The other thing is that I find in clinical care, if I were to say, well, religious organizations say that, you should do X, Y, or Z, I'm not going to get a lot of traction. But if I say it's neuroscience, people get super excited and they're more willing to listen.
What is your neuroscientific or psychiatric understanding of telling the truth? How can it help us get rid of our addictions? And what other strategies do you recommend? How important is it to find maybe a non-addictive, deeper meaning and purpose in life?
Yeah, great question. So a clinical observation that I've made over the years is that my patients who have been able to get into sustained, robust recovery from very severe addictions often are people who recognize that they had to tell the truth. And they had to tell the truth not just about what they were using in terms of, drugs or alcohol or addictive behaviors, but they had to tell the truth about everything. Because if they would start to lie even about the little things, that was going to lead to slippage and eventually relapse and lying about the big things. And I just thought that was really fascinating. And I started to wonder, what is it about, what I call radical truth-telling, lying about things large and small, that primes us for recovery, because it is an interesting phenomenon. And I think it works on many different levels. First of all, I think it may actually strengthen the prefrontal cortex, and there's some science to show that may be true. I think that it improves intimacy. We often feel like if we tell people kind of things that are shameful for us, or we admit mistakes, that they'll like us less. But in fact, the opposite happens, and it really makes people feel more connected to us because they see, their own vulnerability in us, and that makes them feel then less vulnerable themselves. I also think that telling the truth means that we're putting what we're doing, our experiences, into words, and thereby becoming more aware ourselves. One of the things that happens in addiction is that we lose awareness of what we're actually doing. It goes into that space of denial. But when we're telling people, oh, I actually did this, or I actually did spend 4 hours on TikTok, last night instead of sleeping or doing my homework, it's like, oh, wow, I really did do that. And then that awareness provides kind of the motivation for change. So those are just some of the levels at which I think radical honesty is super helpful.
And this kind of truthfulness is linked to another question by a graduate of neuroscience, Honza, who's asking, what is there to be done about the taboo around addictions of any kind? How do you best help people get rid of the shame they feel when they're addicted and rather show appreciation when they are trying to fight it?
Yeah, such a great question. I really think the neuroscience does that by showing people that this is a brain disease and that these changes in the brain contribute to the loss of agency that drives addictive behaviors. I think that really leads to much more empathy and understanding of what's happening. It's not like people are choosing to be addicted. They've essentially had a hijacked brain, and now their brain recognizes or mistakes their drug of choice as necessary for survival. And the drive toward homeostasis is leading to this continual loop of craving and relapse. I think that's the way to destigmatize it. And also just for people to tell stories and be more open about their own struggles. That's what I try to do when I talk about my relatively minor addiction, but an addiction nonetheless to romance novels. When I think about young boys and men, sex addiction, pornography, compulsive masturbation is really, really stigmatized, even more so than drugs and alcohol. Like I'll have patients come in who have no problem telling me about their drugs and alcohol addiction, but it will take many months before they admit, a pornography and compulsive masturbation addiction. There's so much shame and stigma around it. So I think, again, getting these things out in the open, recognizing that a sex addiction is not really at the end of the day about sex. It's about numbing, self-soothing, escaping. I think that information helps people to reframe, reconceptualize, and also recapture empathy.
Did this truthfulness maybe help you as well at some point? I remember a story of you and a student of yours, I think, to whom you were supposed to be his patient in a role play. And then you kind of shared that addiction that you had, and maybe that helped you, or was at the start of helping you?
Oh, yeah, exactly. So, I would joke that I was addicted to romance novels, but I didn't really think I had a problem. But then I was teaching a class of psychiatrists, and we were one student short. So in the role play, I had to play the patient, and we paired off. I was the patient with one young psychiatrist, and he, as per the role play, said, is there a behavior you'd like to change? And I just spontaneously thought, yeah, I'd like to stop my late night reading habit. I didn't share with him what I was reading. That would have been way too embarrassing. But he then said, well, what's one thing you could do to make that change? And I thought, well, I could get rid of my Kindle. Because it was the Kindle and that application of technology to my drug of choice that really had me off and running. So that night I read romance novels as usual, but now I was watching myself read romance novels, and I didn't enjoy it quite as much as I normally would. And the next day I couldn't stop thinking about it. I thought to myself, you know what? I really do want to change that behavior. So it is in using the tool of language to put it into words, to communicate to other people that we really can see it for ourselves.
Maybe there are other people like Honza and Anna who asked you a few questions today in the Czech Republic, listening to us right now, thinking of a career in neuroscience or psychiatry, or are already pursuing it. And maybe some have broader interests beyond these two fields. Thinking of your journey through the humanities and medicine at Yale and Stanford, what message would you like to convey to young people interested in fields or places similar to those you went to or where you now practice psychiatry?
Oh, well, that's a great question. I mean, I invite all kinds of young people to pursue mental health and addiction treatment and just human behavior more broadly, because number one, we are experiencing a golden age in understanding, the brain. And there are so many new tools and so many people doing such great work. It's an exciting time. But more importantly, I would say people are endlessly fascinating. And if you're interested in human behavior, you will never be bored as a psychiatrist. It's really endlessly interesting, or whatever other area of mental health, psychiatry, psychology, you decide to go into. Also, the need is very great, right? More and more people are struggling with mental health issues. So you had asked me earlier about meaning and purpose. I didn't get to answer that, but I would answer it now by the issue of addiction is not just what to avoid, but also what to approach. And finding meaningful work is really important, I think, for a flourishing life. And I think that there is good meaning and purpose to be had in helping people overcome mental health disorders, whatever that may be.
Thank you very much for the interview.
You're welcome.
Bedny, interviews with people who have something to say on Radio Wave. You can listen to Honza Žižka's series on wave.cz and other streaming platforms today.
Thank you for listening all the way to the end. In the next episode, we'll be speaking with Paolo Nespoli, who became the oldest European astronaut when he flew to the International Space Station in 2017. How does seeing our planet from space change us? How can we find the courage to pursue a goal that seems out of reach? And what meaning does space travel have in today's world? Thank you, have a good day, and until next time.